Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Lindsay, and if you haven't been here before, let me just share with you that this channel is about sharing stories and topics from the Bible and stories from my own life in order for things to kind of make a bit more sense. And so today I have something that I'd like to share with you. It's kind of like a collision between a couple of thoughts that I've been having recently. Now, to set the stage, some of you who have been following me for a while know that I have talked about this particular book many times. This is one of my very favorite books. It is a novelized version of the story of Joseph from Genesis, and it's just a beautiful, well-written book, very culturally and historically accurate, and just brings each character and the culture of the time alive. And I just love this book. And so I'm currently rereading it for the umpteenth time because I love it so much. So if you want to go check this out, you can get it on Kindle at the moment. It's very hard to get a copy of the physical copy anymore. They're very rare and very expensive, but you can get a Kindle version. It's called All My Glory on Kindle. And I might leave a link below later. So have a look out for that. But I've been rereading this book recently and, of course, pondering on the life of Joseph. And actually, it's so interesting when you reread a book many times over. So I started reading this book when I was maybe 12 years old, and I was reading it for the storyline and all these different things, and I was learning some beautiful teachings from it. But now, as I am much older, rereading it again, I see different things that I didn't see before. I see parallels in my life of the struggles that Joseph faced in his life in ways that I hadn't experienced before and I hadn't been able to see. And so it's been a beautiful rereading of this book. And I'm about halfway through it again. But also, this collision of ideas that have come together has been partially from reading the story of Joseph once again, and also there is a woman that I've been following on social media for the last couple of years. Her name is Codie Sanchez, and she is a Christian business owner. She is the co-founder of Contrarian Thinking. She just released her book, The Main Street Millionaire. You should definitely go check all of that out. And she talks about, the foundational aspects of what does it mean to be a person in business and how to go about that in a biblically sound kind of way. So yeah, definitely go check her out. But something that she has said a number of times that I've seen pop up and it just kind of collided in my mind this morning is this one thing that she discovered as she was interviewing some other people, as she was talking with her own mentors, her own allies in the business world, about what does it take to be a successful person in business. And one of the things that, when it was studied, was discovered that the majority of wealthy business people in the US are people who have, at some point in their lives, left their hometown. And because they have left their hometown, they have been able to grow beyond what they would have remained to be in that hometown environment. So this might mean they left their hometown to go to a different town for university. It might be very far away, or it might be an hour away. Whatever it was, it might have been that they lived overseas at some point for some reason. Whatever the reason, the simple fact that a person has left their comfortable home environment where people know them and expect them to act in a certain way, now that they have left that environment, they are able to stretch and grow so much beyond what they would have stayed being in that environment. And so as I was listening to Codie this morning, just talking about something online, she brought up this point again, and I just had to pause the video. I just had to sit with this idea of moving away from your hometown and moving so you could stretch and grow. As I've also been reading about the story of Joseph, as I've also been reflecting on my own life, and I have been thinking, well, I'm about to be moving once again. I am about to move for, I think, the 29th time in about 29 years. I'm starting to lose count at this point. It's been so many moves for me. So a little bit of backstory from my life. If you haven't seen me before on here, I have moved, I think, since I was about 1 month old on a semi-regular basis. So my parents moved into our house when I was 1 month old, and then when I was 10 years old, we moved again. So I had the first 10 years of my life in the one home. And then since I was 10 years old, I have moved many, 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 many times. So this has looked like moving to a completely different end of the country at the age of 10 years old and starting a brand new life in a new place without my cousins and my grandparents nearby, going to a new school. And then we moved house in that city a couple of times. And then when I was 14 years old, at a very formative age of my life, my family became missionaries in the Solomon Islands, which is a small island country not far away from the east coast of Australia. So my family packed up and we moved out into the middle of nowhere to a country that, first of all, was at the time so low on the socioeconomic scale. It didn't even have McDonald's in the entire country. So just to put that in perspective for some people. And where I moved was a island away from the main island, away from the main city. We would have to take a boat 14 hours to get to where I lived from the main city, or a 45-minute flight on a rickety little propeller plane which had lots of patches all over the wings, and we'd fly over the mountains, and occasionally we would just suddenly drop in the air and your stomach would lurch and you'd be praying, Jesus, please don't let me die in this moment. And so at the age of 14 to 16 years old, I lived in the Solomon Islands at a Christian hospital there, and I lived the island life, the mission kid life, and it was all very exciting and adventurous, and I have many stories to tell from that experience. But then, at the age of 16, my family moved back to Australia, and we moved back to my grandparents' place for a little while, then we moved back to the previous part of the country that we'd been living in, and then a couple of years later, I moved away from home because now I was 18, and it was my turn to go off to university. And I chose a university that was 2 days' drive from my family home. And so by the age of 18, I'd already moved a number of times. I'd already had an amazing bunch of experiences that most people will never experience even once in their life. And so then at the age of 18, I'd now moved to my university and I was studying, and I would move house or move between the dorms a number of times. And then a couple of years after that, probably about 3 years later, 3 or 4 years later, I moved to Hawaii to be a volunteer missionary by myself. So I moved 4 time zones away from anybody that I knew and moved out into the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And I was actually quite isolated out there, but I had some amazing experiences there for the 5 months that I was there. And then I moved back to Australia. I moved back to my university and I continued my studies. And then a year after I returned home, I ended up moving to another part of Australia, completely different environment. I once again didn't know anybody, and I moved to Melbourne. So I've now lived in Brisbane and Mackay, and then Brisbane and Mackay, and then New South Wales near Sydney, and then Hawaii, and then back to Sydney, and now I moved down to Melbourne. So I've thoroughly lived on the east coast of Australia in the major cities, and overseas twice by this point. And then I moved house in Melbourne 3 times in 2.5 years, all amidst lockdown. And then I moved back to Brisbane during the middle of lockdown, which was a miraculous experience. And then I've moved house in Brisbane, I think at least 3 times in the past 3 years. And now I'm about to move once again back to my old university where I've been studying my master's part-time for the last couple of years, and I'm going back to study full-time. So that's a lot of moving. And if you add up all the little, moving house in the same town sort of thing, I have moved, this will be my 29th time in 29 years. I turned 29 recently. So I think out of out of all people on the planet, I would be high up there for the frequency of moving house and moving away from your hometown. And let me just share some of the types of things that I have experienced with moving all of these many, many times. So, moving away from my family home when I was 10 years old meant that I left my grandparents and my two cousins and my aunties and uncles behind and had to build new friendships and interact with people in a new way when I moved to a new city at the age of 10 years old. And so there was that whole experience, right? And then moving to the Solomon Islands at the age of 14 was a much, much bigger experience. Moving to the Solomon Islands, like people there literally speak a different language or two or three, depending. And so I had to begin trying to immerse myself in the language. I had to navigate an entirely new culture. I had to learn to respect the ways that other people lived because I was actually the person in the minority. I honestly, when I was there at the age of 14 or 15 years old, I would be looking around at everyone else around me, and I was the only white girl on the entire island. That was a fact. And I was like, huh, I'm a minority. I look really white compared to all these people. And I was almost ashamed of my whiteness. Not that I am now, it was just something that I was trying to figure out and understand at the time. But I was like, wow, I have a little glimpse into how other people live their lives feeling like a minority in the Western world. People who don't look like me, but who are in the minority where I come from. And so that was a really important insight that I received at a really important age that was formative for me. And so I had many, many experiences of navigating what does it mean to live life in an island nation and survive and eat the food and learn to cook these different types of food and not have our Western sort of comforts. We didn't have cars or roads or really anything. We had boats and the occasional propeller plane that might or might not fall out of the sky while you're in it. So it had so many really interesting experiences that I gained in that environment, which I've taken back to Australia with me by now being far more aware of cultural diversity and how to interact with certain people from certain backgrounds and how to just start to see how they might be thinking about a certain thing. How can I interact with this person in this particular way that I might not otherwise if I just stayed in Brisbane my entire life, for example. And so that was one thing that I took away from that environment. And then moving away from my parents when I turned 18 to go to university 2 days drive away, that was once again a massive, massive learning curve for me. It meant I had to now fend for myself. It wasn't just my parents were fending for us in a new country. I was now fending for myself in a new part of my own country, which I could, I sort of knew how to navigate to some degree, but I had to learn how to take public transport by myself for the first time between my university and my relatives that lived a couple of hours nearby. And like there was so many things that I had to learn by myself without having my parents to fall back on. Now, I just want to make a note. It is wonderful for young people to have good connections around them when they are going through difficult changes. I went hard mode, okay? I went off and did things by myself. I was independent and I could do it all by myself, right? And I didn't need my family, and that's what I told myself. And it was a really difficult experience, but it certainly helped me to grow. It helped me to be resilient. I would couch surf. I would stay at different friends' places. I would learn how to be a polite guest and show appreciation so that they would let me come and stay with them the next time I needed somewhere to stay. Like I learned all sorts of interesting life skills by moving away from my family and figuring it out. So there is definitely something to be said about that kind of action that you can take in your life to move away from your hometown or move away from your systems of comfort and people you can fall back on. And not only did it teach me life skills, but it really taught me to rely completely on God. And I'll say that this happened to a large degree when I moved to university for my undergraduate degree, but it also happened at an immensely more intense experience when I moved to Melbourne right before lockdown began, and I got stuck there without anybody that I knew. So moving to university, I had to rely on God for my provision, for the tuition fees, for everything, right? I needed to rely on God, and God came through for me time after time, and He has taught me, He has shown me that He loves me, and He is my good Father who provides for my needs. But when I went to Melbourne, He showed me that He is my good Father who lavishes me with good things, whether I need them or not. And so that was a new step in my relationship with God as I followed His leading. I didn't want to move to Melbourne. I knew I didn't know anybody there and I didn't really want to go. But I said, God, I will go if that is where you're leading. And the doors opened. And so I went and I learnt new experiences there. And I grew in my relationship with God to a much deeper level. It was in this time in Melbourne where I was stuck there in the most locked down city in the entire world. It was locked down the longest and the toughest in the entire world. And that's why God decided to lead me right before lockdown began. And I believe He did this in order for my relationship with Him to grow. And so while I was there, I learned to trust God with my heart. I learned to open my heart to Him like as to a friend, and not just to rely on Him like a genie in the bottle to give me the things that I needed, but also just to be there as my comfort and my support, because I didn't have friends. I didn't have family nearby. I didn't have people that I could hug, and I'm a very huggy person. And so it was a time of, a much richer, deeper experience in my walk with Jesus. And I couldn't have had that by just staying at home at all, or staying in the last place that I even was, the last place that I grew comfortable in. And so eventually I got to the point where I said, God, okay, I'm here. I'm stuck in lockdown. I might never leave this place. Let me try to make the most and the best of the opportunity that I have while I'm here. And as soon as I had that intention in my heart, that submission, that resignation to this is my lot in life, let me make the best of it, very, very shortly, like within a month, I had miraculously been moved up to Queensland where there was basically no restrictions, and it was actually impossible to cross the border, but God miraculously brought me through the border, and I've been living here in Queensland for the last 3 years. And I just feel like God put me through that situation in Melbourne until the point where my heart was just ready to fully surrender and submit to His leading. And then as soon as that lesson was learned and I was fully submitted, then He plucked me out and said, okay, we're going to the next thing now. And so I've been here in the last 3 years, and I have been working in various churches, and I've had so many other new experiences that I wouldn't have had back in Melbourne. And it's been a really wonderful experience. It's been very tough. It's been a lot more stretching and growing, but each previous experience has set me up for the following one. And each move has given me opportunities to learn and grow where I wouldn't have had those opportunities in the previous place. And so I have very much just said, okay, God, like as much as I want to put down roots somewhere and I want to have a cute garden and I want to get married and I want to have kids and I want to just like be settled because I've moved so many times, if I have to be a gypsy for the rest of my life, then so be it. Like if that's what God wants for me, maybe not, maybe it is, but like if that's what He wants for me, I will stretch and I will grow as much as He calls me to, which is a scary thing to think. Like, what's next, right? But I've learned to trust God far more than what I could come up with for my life myself. And so I'm now at this point where I'm about to move once again in a couple months' time back down to my university. It's a place that I feel comfortable with. I've lived there before. It'll be a different experience once again. And I'm just like, okay, God, what are you going to do next? How am I going to grow next? hate it while it's happening and look back and go, I'm glad I went through that? Probably. But this is the new season of life I'm in, and who knows where this will lead in the future. Recently, as I was pondering whether or not I should move back down to university and study full time, my stepdad shared with me that he felt impressed to say that, Lindsay, you should lean into this, you should follow the recommendation to move back to Avondale full time, because when you do, God will provide and you'll be prepared to do so much more in the future in ways that you would not be able to otherwise. And so this all very much just ties into what I've been sharing, right? I don't know what that's going to look like, but I look forward to finding out. And so I just wanted to link this back to the story of Joseph. So let's just do a really quick flyover of the story of Joseph, which you find in the last half of the book of Genesis. There's probably, I don't know, like 15 chapters or so just on the story of Joseph alone. So Joseph, he was a spoiled brat teenage boy who was the most favorite son of Jacob, and his 10 older brothers hated his guts because he had all these dreams of greatness that God had given him, prophetic dreams, and he unwisely shared these dreams with people who did not have his best interests at heart. And so they were jealous and they sold him into slavery because they weren't good guys, even though they ended up being the fathers of the Israelite nation. Anyway, God had given Joseph these two dreams that meant the same thing. The dreams in the wheat field, where the wheat bowed down to Joseph's wheat, and where the sun, moon, and stars bowed down to Joseph once again. And these two dreams together signified that one day Joseph would be a great person in some sense. And obviously his brothers didn't like the idea of bowing down before him, even though ultimately they would one day. So they took the matters into their own hands. They sold him into slavery. Slaves in that time, 2,000 years ago, in the land of Egypt in particular, where Joseph would be taken to, they weren't considered to live very long. They were treated very poorly. They were just treated like property and not like people. And so Joseph's dreams of greatness probably died in his heart when this happened. And he was probably terrified. So a little while after he was sold, it would have taken maybe a couple of weeks to arrive in the land of Egypt. He was sold to a person who was an official in Pharaoh's court. And as he was working for Potiphar over the next 13-ish years, he rose through the ranks and he learnt and he grew in new ways that he wouldn't have been able to otherwise if he had stayed with his father and his brothers in the land of Canaan. If he had stayed in the promised land, he would not have been able to gain the skills necessary to become great like God had called him to be. So we see that, he was doing the best job he could as a bratty 17-year-old in his home environment, but God actually took him away. And I want to find that verse. I should have prepared this earlier, but it'll be right at the end of Genesis, where his brothers, after Jacob, their father, passes away, his brothers are terrified that they're going to be in trouble. So let's see. It's in should be in chapter 50, if you want to join me there. Yes, okay, chapter 50, verse 15. And when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, they said, Joseph will peradventure hate us, and will certainly requite us all the evil which we did unto him. And they sent a messenger unto Joseph, saying, Thy father did command before he died, saying, So shall ye say unto Joseph, Forgive, I pray thee now, the trespass of thy brethren and their sin, for they did unto thee evil. And now we pray thee, forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of thy father. And Joseph wept when they spake unto him. And his brethren also went and fell down before his face, and they said, Behold, we be thy servants. And Joseph said unto them, Fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you thought evil against me. They thought to do evil to Joseph, but God meant it unto good to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. Okay, so that's the point I wanted to get to. So even though Joseph's brothers hated him and they sold him, and it was a malicious act, it was actually God's intention for Joseph to go through the many difficult things that he did, and to be ripped away from his people and the places and the things that he loved, and to be taken through many years of difficulty in order to be in the place that God had originally intended him to get to. So he becomes a slave, and then for the next maybe 10 years, he's working as a slave. He rises through the ranks. He becomes the steward or the manager of everything that this official owns, that Potiphar owns. And it's to the point that Potiphar doesn't even know what he owns anymore. He's so wealthy because of Joseph. Now, for Joseph to be that type of manager, he would have to learn how to deal with people. He would have to learn how to manage things. He would have to learn how to do everything administrative that he probably wouldn't have had the opportunity to do for his dad at their home. So he would have learned all the ins and outs of what it means to be on an estate of an official, and also learned all the political intrigues that his master was dealing with in his work for the pharaoh. He would have come into contact with various other officials visiting the house. He would have learned the different types of etiquette that was involved in dealing with these people. And he would have learned just, what does it mean to be an Egyptian and how to function in that society when it comes to their religious belief systems, their belief in the afterlife. Not that he had to choose to agree with it or go along with it, but he had to learn to work within that world. Okay? And so he had 13 years to learn this, including the 3 years that he was thrown in prison. And now prisoners in that time did not stay in prison very long. Prison was not a place of punishment. It was a place of preparation for a punishment or for judgment. And so usually prisoners would only stay a couple of days and then they would be out. But Joseph, he was left there. He was forgotten for 3 years. But in that time, he also, his gifts, his natural abilities that God had given to him came to the fore, and he ended up running the prison once again. And now he wasn't just running an estate that was isolated, but he was meeting people from every walk of life, from every end of the land. And it was a place where everybody's experiences could come out, and he could interact with these people. He could hear news from the outside world. He could discover what it meant to go through various types of judgment, what these different crimes were, what the needs of the people were at a larger scale. And so after 3 years in that prison, he was also once again trained to go into his next position. So he was put into slavery, which prepared him to have administrative skill. And then he was placed into prison, which he probably thought was a terrible thing the entire time he was there. It might have even shaken his faith further once again. And then in that time, he was being prepared even further for the next thing that God had for him, where God took him and made him the prime minister of the most powerful country in the entire world. He was basically prime minister of the world at the time. And because of the past 13 years of moving and learning and growing and getting new experiences, he was then prepared to be in the position that God had given him the dream about originally. So I just want to encourage you guys that if you are going through moves, if God is calling you to move house, to move to a new city, to move to a new country perhaps, or to move to a new job or to a new environment or to a new position, don't be fearful. Yes, it might be difficult. It might be a new experience. There might be a great learning curve involved. Joseph had to learn an entire new language before he could learn anything else, right? So, whatever the learning experience is, whatever the new thing is that God is calling you to in this time, and I feel like there is somebody out there who is wrestling with God right now and not sure if they can trust that God is calling them, or that God will be with them where He is calling them. You need to trust Him. God has everything figured out, and you don't need to know the details. You just need to trust God and take that next step. And so that is my encouragement for you today. Take that next step, move, and like Codie Sanchez says, that you will have so much higher likelihood of success if you move out of your comfort zone, if you move out of your natural environment and you have that opportunity to grow. And so that is all I have to share with you guys today. Thank you so much for listening. Please share this with somebody who needs to hear it. I'll talk to you later. Bye.